Good evening, everyone. Today we're going to continue our study, as we have for a little while, anyway, on our midweek studies on extraordinary biblical women. So far, we've covered women from Genesis. Um, we have covered Eve. We've covered Sarah. We've covered Leah, and today we're going to begin to cover Jochebed. Jochebed is a character that we do not know a whole lot about, but her story is pretty compelling. Um, some of you may be wondering, well, who is this? Who is Jochebed? Now, when you look into the scriptures, we only come across her in the first few chapters of Exodus, but her story is very important, and it has influence beyond those few chapters, and really indirectly through a lot of other means. So Jochebed was the mother of Moses, and there are three things that I want us to pull out about Jochebed. And the reason I believe that her story is so compelling is because when you think about the situation and the circumstances that she found herself in, how difficult it must have been. If you remember in the book of Exodus, as we open up Exodus chapter 1, we remember that Jacob's family has made their way to Egypt because there was a great famine. And so, of course, Joseph had become, through a very unique and divinely maneuvered set of circumstances, becomes the second in command of the Egyptian kingdom. We remember how he got down there. We remember the situation with his brothers, um, and how they had come back down to get some food during the famine, and how he manipulated to be able to see his full-blood brother Benjamin again. They came back for more food, and then he finally, through several different dramatic events that are connected to that story, he finally confessed to who he was and what had happened. He goes up. They go up. They could bring down Jacob. He sees Joseph, and lives in Egypt for a good little while, for the last several years of his life, and that's where Jacob's family stays for, as God told Abraham, over 400 years. And so we learn in Exodus 1 that a new Pharaoh arose, and he enslaves the people of Israel. Now, this is a difficult thing to try to figure out when it comes to the time frame, because it does not appear that Israel is enslaved for the 430 years. In fact, the wording of the scripture here implies that they are only enslaved for the reign of that Pharaoh, as well as the reign of his son. So, not the 430 years, and nor should we expect them to be slaves there, because Joseph was a national hero. The Israelites would have been protected there, and would have been welcomed and continue to be welcomed in the land of Goshen until a new Pharaoh arises. Now, the wording here, a new Pharaoh, does not give us any indication that it was someone who had descended from the Egyptian Pharaoh that was in power during the days of Joseph. And interesting enough, about this time in history, we now know that there was a war, an invading force that had come into Egypt and defeated the dynasty of the kings that of the pharaohs that were around the time of Joseph, and leading up to the days of Moses. And so he didn't know about Joseph. He didn't care. Someone would say, well, how did he not know? That was only a few hundred years before. The Egyptians, of all the ancient people, were probably the best. There may have been a few others that were very good at it as well, but at keeping records of their history. So how did he not know? Well, the thing is that you do in ancient cultures when you conquer someone is you get rid of, I say ancient cultures, the grief we still do it today, when you try to take over, or you do take over a nation or a kingdom, the first thing you do is you get rid of their history. You hide their culture. You burn it. You destroy it. When people say, why don't we have much evidence about Joseph or Moses, there's lots of reasons for that, actually. People didn't view history as we typically have viewed it. You wanted to break someone's spirit and make them forget who they were within a couple of generations, and it doesn't take long. You get rid of their you get rid of their history. You burn the books, so to speak. Of course, they didn't have books then. But you burn all the records. You break the records. You destroy them. Get rid of them so that they forget. So this Pharaoh, he probably is not the first in the dynasty, but he doesn't know who Joseph is. Wouldn't care who Joseph was to begin with. He sees Israelites. They have been in Egypt. They would have known about them, obviously, from when they invaded, and so he doesn't know who they are. Or he knows who they are. He doesn't want them to attack them as they had invaded, and so he enslaves them. And it's a cruel enslavement, and these are the circumstances that Jochebed and her husband Amram find themselves in. Now, of course, he's oppressing the people. He's oppressing the Israelites. The Egyptian Pharaoh is, and if you remember, he sends out some edicts. He tells the handmaids that when an Israelite child is born, if it's a girl, they should let her live. If it's a boy, then they were to kill the baby as soon as the Hebrew mother gave birth. Of course, they feared God, we're told in Exodus, and they didn't do it, and so God also blessed their families because of their faithfulness to Him. So Pharaoh figures out that something's going on. He questions them about it. They get out of trouble, and he sends out another edict. Now the babies are to be taken from their mothers. The baby boys will be taken from their mothers and thrown into the Nile River. And of course, in the Nile River, they would either drown or be devoured by the creatures that live there, such as the crocodiles. Literally, I suppose I should say figuratively. Figuratively, the Pharaoh is turning the Nile River into a river of blood, which is the first plague later on. I'm not going to get into those, but I do want you to consider that you have Pharaoh who puts the baby boys into the river, turning it into a river of blood. Figuratively, God literally turns it into a river of blood. When he comes back, it does seem to indicate that he's reminding the new Pharaoh of what his father had done, and as he begins the plagues, maybe a subtle way of saying, this is when it all started for the oppression of my people, and how they began to cry out, and so God would deliver them through Jochebed's son Moses. Now, even though God promises to be with us, doesn't mean that everything's going to be favorable. Doesn't mean we're going to have favorable circumstances. It just means that he's going to be with us when the circumstances are also unfavorable. And that's the case of what it was with the people of Israel in Egypt. Imagine being a pregnant mother in the days of that Pharaoh, wondering if you had a child, if you had your child, was it going to be a girl, was it going to be a boy, hoping that you were going to have a girl, so you wouldn't have to worry about the Egyptian soldiers finding your newborn son, ripping him away from you and throwing him into the river. And then be one of those mothers that bore a baby boy, and knowing the danger that he was in. We're not told that any other mother tried to hide their son. It's very likely that they did. It's very likely that most of them would not just hand their children over willingly to be devoured by crocodiles. What a nightmare scenario that had to have been. People have gone through a lot in the history of our world at the hands of those that were supposedly leaders but nothing more than tyrants. Whether it be one, whether it be many, people have been oppressed often throughout history, and it continues even today. And yet, people also continue to rise above and to keep their faith in God. And that's exactly what Jochebed did. See, Jochebed's life is a portrait of faith, and it's a portrait of faith because she was in those circumstances. That she was a slave, oppressed heavily. It wasn't, like most throughout history, most people have been slaves. Um, if you were to add all of the people up that have lived throughout the history of mankind, most people have been slaves. And we still have a lot of slaves today in our world. And so sometimes slavery is just something similar to employment in a different system. Oftentimes it's very oppressive. And so it was oppressive here in Egypt, obviously, of the worst kind. A nightmare. I can't even imagine what that must have been like to have to go through that. And the idea that she kept her faith. And here's the next thing that I want you to think about. You and I have an advantage over all the people that lived in Bible times. What's that advantage? We have the Bible. We have Genesis through Revelation. Most people through the scripture that lived in Bible times, they didn't have a copy of their own Bible. You couldn't, because it was too expensive to print. Most people didn't have money. It was too expensive to print one copy because you didn't have the printing press, and so one person, a scribe, would write down verbatim, word for word, letter for letter, dotting the I's, crossing the T's. That was their job, and it took a lot of time. So it cost, and materials were not cheap. It wasn't cheap to produce paper like it is today. So we have an advantage that we actually have the Bible. Of course, you don't even need paper now. You can do it digitally on your phone or your computer. You can carry several different versions of the Bible with you wherever you go if you download the proper app on the computer. But anyhow, not only did they not have Bibles, Jochebed was living in a time period that none of it had yet been written. Genesis had not yet been written, and we know this because Moses was the one who wrote Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. The only thing that we know of that she had would have been the oral traditions of the elders that would have connected them to their past. She would have known about the promise. She would have known about all of those things that they had told. But that's all she had to go on. And yet, she had faith. She had faith in God during those difficult days of her life. See, her life was a portrait of faith, but it was also a portrait of courage. Think about this. Hiding your baby from soldiers. I don't know how long they hid Moses from the soldiers. I don't know how they hid him. That would have to have been in his house. They would have tried to have been so discreet. They already had two children, Miriam and Aaron, and so likely they employed their help to keep the baby quiet. Maybe grandparents. I don't know how things worked back then. However, what we do know is it's only been fairly recently that family units are broken up into just father, mother, and children. And of course, now through much of the United States, it's not even the nuclear family is becoming something of the past, unfortunately. But before was much like the oldest male of the family was the leader. He was the patriarch. And so we can figure out who Moses' grandfather was by reading some of the genealogies, but that's about all we know of him. So maybe they employed the grandparents to try to help take care of him and to be discreet as it could be. I mean, think about the fact they didn't have things to keep babies that quiet. I'm sure they had their tricks, but anytime the baby would have cried, gotten hungry and cried out, or gotten sad or angry and cried out, or just what have you, they would have been nervous that someone, someone uh, on patrol would have heard the baby and come busting in. And so, as it got to the point that she couldn't hide the child anymore, she concocted a plan. Now, here's the interesting thing: she technically does exactly what Pharaoh told them to do. She puts her baby in the river. She technically obeyed. And she built her plan around this. She still had to have courage to put her baby there, because you don't know what's going to happen. She does put her baby where she does put Moses. Of course, she didn't name him Moses. That was the name that the Egyptian princess gave him, which means drawn out. But she put the baby there in the ark, which is the same word that's used for two different things in the scriptures: the ark of Noah, Noah's ark, and the ark of the covenant. Both, in all three instances, we get the idea that this is a box, and so we don't want to miss this connection. You have the ark of Noah, you have the ark of Moses. The ark of Noah saves mankind, really, and the animals, so that we would continue after, I guess you could say, what we would say in the 21st century after the apocalypse of the flood. And then you have the Ark of the Covenant, which also saves in a different way, but many times it saves God's people in battle, as the presence of God went before them. And now you have the ark of reeds that Moses is in, and of course that saves Moses. So that there are connections here that we need to make sure that we're picking up on. This is what Jochabed did by putting her baby inside an ark of reeds in order to keep him safe. We also see that she had great faith because she raised her son. Even after all of this, we remember that Miriam was waiting in the river close to where they had put Moses, and she offers to go get one of the Hebrew mothers for the child. And of course, she goes back and gets her mom. She goes back and gets Jochebed, and she raises Moses as a Hebrew, even while he is at the same time being raised as an Egyptian. Let's see, I want us to read something, I think, in Hebrews chapter 11. Make sure I find the right thing here. Verse 23 of Hebrews 11. By faith Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months. So that gives us how much time they had him there. I had forgotten Hebrews did this. Hidden for 3 months by his parents. So, talking about the faith of his parents, because they saw that the child was beautiful and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Why? He knew who he was. He knew he may have been raised by the princess, but in one way, she provided for him. The royals provided for him as an adoptive son, but he wasn't raised by her. He was raised by his mother in those first several years. He knew exactly who he was. Not like in the Ten Commandments movie with Charlton Heston, or The Prince of Egypt, the animated movie that came out in the 90s. Moses didn't know who he was until later on in life, and he knew exactly who he was the whole time. And that's very much apparent as we read through the scriptures. But it says in verse 25 of Hebrews 11, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. That's all because of his parents, all because of his mother. And so his parents acted in faith. They had great courage. And courage is the natural offspring of faith in these circumstances. Because faith is not just, hey, I'm going to go to church on Sunday and then you're not going to know anything. You're not going to know anything about my spiritual beliefs. Faith guides us, informs us, and makes us who we are. So when you hear people, politicians, and people on the news talking about folks having great faith, but that faith is only there, they only lean on their faith when they're in times of crisis. That's not faith. That's a crutch. It's okay to have a crutch. Faith can be our crutch, but if that's all it is, it's not faith. Just put it in a uh, just I don't think I've ever been on crutches, but I know people are on crutches. Why do you use crutches? Because you're down. Maybe you broke your foot. Maybe you broke your toe or your leg. You got to use the crutch in order to walk. You got to use it in order to support yourself. So that's what faith is to a lot of people. And what do you do when your leg or your toe or your foot heals? You keep walking around with that crutch? Hopefully not. I know some people still have to use a cane for a while. But once you have total and complete healing and your leg is back to being normal, your bone is back to being where it was supposed to be, or whatever injury you may have, you put it up. You don't use it anymore. That's what people do with their faith so much. And it's not the biblical definition of faith. Don't put it up. But instead, use it for every instance of your life. And that's really the same thing as we see with prayer. A lot of people will say, "What can I do?" And they'll say, "Just pray." Or, "The only thing I have left is prayer." That's the only thing you had to begin with. Don't finish with prayer. Start with prayer, continue in prayer, and finish with prayer. That is what our faith teaches us to do. By looking at this, we see that faith is one of those things. It's like a muscle memory. You keep doing something over and over and over until eventually your body does something over and over and over until you don't really think about it. It's just natural, second nature. That's what faith needs to be. You got to exercise your faith until it's just second nature. You know what to do because of who you have become by the guidance that your faith in God has led you to be. And this is what Jochabed did. It wasn't even something that she questioned. By all indications of the scripture, she knew she was going to disobey the king because she was going to obey God. An incredibly brave woman. Nothing taken away from her husband. We are talking about incredible women of the Bible. She has a portrait of faith, a portrait of courage, and she was also a portrait of wisdom. And her wisdom and her faith, or her wisdom rather, is reflected in both her faith and her courage. Her wisdom is reflected in her strategic placement of Moses in the reeds. What do I mean by that? Well, again, not like the movies. I don't think I've ever watched the Ten Commandments more than once, and that was 30 years ago. So I'm not sure how this is portrayed. But in other movies, like The Prince of Egypt, which is a solid movie in and of itself, you have them just putting him in the river, and he's going through an adventure as a baby inside that little basket of reeds. Crocodiles are trying to take the ark down into the bottom of the river where they can have a feast. Hippopotami are chasing after it. Fishermen catch it in their nets. It almost overturns a couple of different times, and then it just happens to float into the reeds where the princess is. That's not what the Bible says. They placed him in the reeds. Why would they have done that? Because they knew where the princess was going to be. Jochebed knew of the princess, who must have had, like many young women do, a reputation for compassion. Not just young women, young men too, but certainly young women oftentimes have a reputation of compassion. And so she knows where to set the baby. And she knows that once, or at least she believes, she has faith, that once the princess is going to look on the baby, she's going to know where he's from. It's not going to trick her. But she also knows from her reputation that she won't kill the baby, but rather she'll take the baby in. So her wisdom is reflected there. And her wisdom was also reflected in her children's lives. What do I mean by that? Well, this is about all we know about Jochebed. But her three children, Miriam, Aaron, and the youngest, Moses, were the three of the greatest leaders that Israel ever had. And she raised those children. She had to have raised them in the knowledge of God and in faith. It didn't mean that any of them were perfect. Miriam made mistakes. Aaron made mistakes. Moses made mistakes. But her children, I believe, reflected her wisdom and her courage and her faith well. I hope you enjoyed this study. I have enjoyed it so far, coming to admire these ladies more than I have in the past by thinking about things that they must have gone through, trying to empathize with them and put myself in their shoes. I hope maybe that has done the same for you. Next week we will continue our study, and we will look at probably look at Miriam. We may look at Zipporah, Moses' wife, though I'm not 100% sure about Zipporah yet. But we will look at Miriam. I hope you all have a good evening, and we will see you soon. Bye-bye.